Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to League Analysis. I'm Handygamer, and I'm back to discuss the draft between SKT and RNG in the World's semifinals this year, which is 2017. And today I want to be looking into the draft in the very first game and kind of explain my thoughts with regards to that matter. But before we actually get there, I want to first take a closer look at the draft priorities that the two teams came up or had coming into this series. Obviously, RNG were playing to close the game during a very strong mid game. They were looking to use Uzi for that, so they had to draft some kind of composition where Uzi could play to his fullest potential, where they would give him the tools necessary to carry the game, but also equip his team with enough potential to protect Uzi and Xiaohu for that matter. And on the opposite side, SKT were looking to win through their decision making, both through macro plays in general and stronger late game decision making in team fights and the likes. Obviously, they had to stop Uzi in a sense, and their first two drafts kind of go towards that direction. But later on in the series, they were drafting more towards enabling Bang, so that they would have to funnel down on shutting down Uzi, but instead have a separate win condition with a Bang on a hyper carry that actually is able to do stuff. So, what are the two teams' most favorite picks? What are they looking for in their draft? With RNG, you can see very high priority on Sejuani as a jungler. They decide to first pick her a couple of times on the blue side. They ban her away on red side in the game in between. And later on force SKT to ban the Sejuani. Or, well, even if SKT doesn't feel forced, they still do it anyways, so props to RNG for coming up with that pick and pulling it out and using it to its fullest potential. They also go for the Shen on the top side. Again, they want to play around Uzi. They have let me as a very strong tank role player sitting on the top side. Shen can also help you in terms of macro game, so very strong pick for what they can play. Let me better champions. Anyways, so yeah, obvious focus on that. And the Janna for Ming, to me, is majorly due to the fact that it enables Uzi to have somewhat of a safe laning phase, but B, it also is pretty useful during team fights if the enemy team manages to they draft a composition where they can threaten your backline through dives. Then Janna cannot just peel for one carry, but instead reset the entire fight and enable both carries, so Xiaohu and Uzi, to actually go about their business and deal damage to the enemy team. On the opposite side, obviously, it's been discussed after the series a bunch of times, and I think everybody knows it. Galio is the highest pick priority for SKT. They pick him 100% of the games, every time Faker gets to play that champion. And I think the major reason for that is that he kind of enables their game plan. And a minor point in their game plan is also to neutralize Xiaohu, but Galio is just such an effective champion at neutralizing the mid lane because he can most of the times just go ahead and wave clear if he doesn't overextend greedily. He can also support both side lanes with his ultimate, and he offers a very strong front line during the later stages of the game where he can really try to shut down Uzi, forcing him to attack the Galio through the taunt and negate a lot of his damage potential, again, through the damage reduction of his ultimate. Also, SKT have a very high priority on the Tristana, also pretty reasonable, same as Twitch for Uzi. Uzi has been using the Twitch to attack the entire team at the same time. On the opposite side, Tristana is a bit of a less aggressive pick in terms of team fighting. She has much more defensive capabilities than the Twitch, and as a result, has less AoE damage during the team fight, but is more of a cleanup AD carry. However, she offers a very strong laning phase. She has a very good turret taking potential, which severely lacks. Not just because his range is significantly lower than the Tristana, but also his passive, the true damage, kind of prevents him from chipping at enemy champions and turrets at the same time. That's something that Tristana doesn't really have to fear. Her only problem is if she triggers the bomb on the turret while there are enemy champions close by, then she might end up having to step out of the turret for 1 or 2 shots. Other than that, she's perfectly fine, she's perfectly safe. You don't really need to draft any defensive support for her, but you can still go ahead and draft the Lulu. Lulu for SKT during the first game, as we will see, has a ban priority. However, during the course of the series, they will return to picking up the Lulu for Wolf plenty of times. It's a very strong Art and Sensor support. It really enables your AD carry to go ahead and carry, which I think is what their shift in mentality really was after the second game. And the last pick we need to talk about for SKT is the Gnar, because the Gnar simply is the strongest meta pick right now against the tanks on the top side. Huni has shown previous to the series that he's capable of playing that champion, and with Gnar you also have strong disengage potential. For example, if your backline gets dove, you can simply use the Gnar if you're with the team and in Mega Gnar form, not just to ult and play a setup CC combo, but also just to knock all the divers aside and toss them towards the backside. Now, if you take a look at the bans that both teams go for, we immediately see that the jungle trifecta that I was talking about during the first video of this series will be completed through the bans. But before we actually get to that, let's just focus on another ban that RNG actually go for in each and every single one of their games, and that is the Jace. The only reason why Huni kind of tries to default back to the Gnar is that Jace is banned against him 100% of all the 5 times that these two teams met. Why is that? Well, mostly it comes down to the high pick priority that RNG have on the Shen. They want to remove the Jace because it's a very strong counter to the Shen, because Spirit's Refuge is just neglectable for a Jace unless he goes for the all-in. And additionally, Huni has been doing exceptionally well on the champion, has been solo carrying some games on it. So they just want to remove it and remove a potential win condition for SKT that can be achieved pretty easily with the Jace just snowballing his lane. Now let's talk about the jungle. RNG show a very high ban priority on the Gragas throughout the entire series. Every single time they are on blue side, they will use their third ban for the Gragas. So I would assume if there wasn't Kalista in the game, which you have to ban on the red side, they would also have opted to ban the Gragas on the red side. As I discussed in the previous video that you can check back on if you really feel like it, Gragas has a very high win rate against most champions except for Sejuani, and I think the Gragas is just a very strong pick in terms of overall meta, and at the same time I think RNG didn't really feel comfortable playing against the Gragas because Gragas has a lot of potential to counteract the Twitch's all in. Because if Twitch opens up with his spray and pray, you just toss a barrel in his face and it's gone. And I think that's another reason why we don't see the Gragas in this series that often. On the opposite side, SKT during the first 3 games ban away the jargon, and I think that's mostly due to the fact that Blank doesn't feel comfortable playing the champion or didn't perform too well on it or whatever it might be. I don't think it's because they are afraid of MLXG playing the champion. As soon as Peanut gets subbed in, they leave the Jarvan open, MLXG goes for the Jarvan, and Peanut will answer with the Gragas. And I don't think it's a Blank being unable to play the Gragas himself either, because during the second game of the series, Blank actually gets to play the Gragas, and he's doing pretty fine with it. So I don't think it's the matchup itself that is problematic in terms of SKT's draft, but they are unwilling to leave the Jarvan open together with the Sejuani, because they are afraid of RNG picking the Sejuani and them being unable to pick up the Jarvan themselves, and thus they kind of feel pressure to take the Jarvan away. Even if, say, RG don't go for picking the Sejuani, but instead end up banning her, which is entirely possible in some of the drafts that you'll be getting to see. SKT don't want to have the Jarvan left open as the last option for them. I mean, in some cases, for example, during the first game, RNG could have opted to not ban the Gragas, but the Sejuani instead, if SKT didn't ban the Jarvan. So I think Blank really didn't want to play the champion. As soon as he gets subbed out and Peanut is starting, they leave the Jarvan open. They pick it themselves during the 5th game, and they are doing pretty fine with it. So I don't think it's the team not being able to play around it. I think it's solely the one player not performing too well for whatever reason, and I think that's the major reason why they actually swapped Peanut for Bang. Now, what is left in terms of bans? As I mentioned, on the top side for RNG you have Let Me, who's a very strong tank player, and thus SKT end up banning the Cho'Gath almost every single game, and the only reason they don't ban him in the 5th game is because they always use it as a ban during the 2nd ban rotation, and Let Me has actually locked in the Shen during the 1st rotation, so there's no point in banning the Cho'Gath. So that's definitely the highest priority ban for SKT. And after the 1st game, they now include Janna and Shen in their ban rotation. Janna being one of their first 3 bans throughout the remainder of the series, and Shen being one of their second phase bans during games 2 through 4. So they obviously recognize the potential of Ming and of Let Me on those 2 champions. They want to take them away and kind of unlock their game plan, which is get on top of Uzi, pressure him, and get the split push going with Huni without giving the Shen as an option to RNG. Now RNG have a 3rd ban pattern that we have to talk about, and that is the lovers duo on the bot side. That's Xayah and Rakan. Every single time they are on blue side, they ban away either one of the 2. Not both, but at least one of them. And I think that's because they don't feel like they want to play the bot lane themselves, and they don't want to first pick any of the two to deny the potential bot lane from SKT, so they feel pressured to ban one of those two champions in each and every game. And I think that's a very huge benefit for SKT, because RNG actually show that they aren't willing to go for that composition, and they force themselves to ban it away, even on red side. At least during the fourth game, during the second game, they decided to pick the Rakan on red side instead, because they are again afraid of SKT going for that bot lane without them actually locking in the duo lane, which is available at that point. But we'll get to that in the next video when I'll be taking a look at the second game. Now, I wanted to go through those draft priorities before actually talking about any of the drafts, because for one, I can now hint at what's to follow, and secondly, I can always now refer to this, and I can thus reduce the length of the remaining videos. So yeah, thanks for sticking through that with me. I hope you get at least my perception of the team's priorities, and I will use that as a foundation of the following arguments that I wanted to make in terms of the draft. Now, if you take a look at the actual draft, we can see obviously the bans that I discussed. We have Jace, Xayah, and Gragas for Royal Never Give Up during the first rotation. It was expected, given their priorities that they showed overall throughout the series. And on the opposite side, obviously, you have to ban away the Kalista. They decide to ban away the Jarvan before seeing the Gragas ban, which is, I think, pretty important to keep in mind. And they also ban away the Lulu. Now, I think Lulu and Janna are, in general, considered to be like you ban one of the two, and the other one is left open, and you have to kind of figure out which one of the two fits better to the opposing team's identity and the playstyle of their bot lane, especially their support. Lulu obviously is more proactive during the laning phase, has more of a bully potential, but Janna is the better reset during the team fights, especially against diving compositions. Now, RNG start up with a Sejuani. I think a pretty obvious choice there. As I discussed in the previous video, she's the most commonly picked jungler right now. She is doing fine in each and every single matchup. They even banned away the Gragas that was left after Jarvan was banned for the remaining parts of the jungle trifecta. So they are doing pretty fine in terms of jungle. SKT obviously follow their priorities, go for the Galio, go for the Tristana, pretty standard stuff, 100% reasonable from my point of view. Janna and Twitch, obvious answers for RNG. They get 3 of their most important picks, and they also get to react with their solo lanes, which is, I think, pretty standard drafting right now. You go for the jungler and the bot lane during the first phase of the draft, and then follow up with their solo laners later on, because then you can counter whatever one lane the opposite side has to reveal. However, you can see SKT don't follow that pattern. They go for the Galio each and every single time, and now they complete their first draft rotation with the Blitzcrank. And I think that's a pick we have to talk about, not only in terms of the actual champion, but also the timing in the draft where you reveal that champion. And I think that's where Blank's champion pool, again, plays a role. SKT decide to pick the Blitzcrank here, which is a pick they haven't played before. It's just a pick that was played against them. It was doing pretty fine until Midset completely screwed over their execution. So it's a pick that actually can work in the current metagame if you don't want to run RN Sensor supports, but instead want to pressure at the bot side, go for the Blitzcrank. It's a-okay. But you can, from my perspective, choose to reveal the Blitzcrank much later on in the draft. You can go throughout the second ban phase without actually losing Blitzcrank due to the bans, but instead you could go for a high priority jungler here if you had one left that you think could be banned out pretty easily. But instead, they picked the Blitzcrank here, allowing for RNG to adapt in their draft much better. And they choose to pick the Zac later on, and thus say it's more important for us that the Zac doesn't get answered too easily than actually the Blitzcrank being answered. And I think that's in some part reasonable. In other parts, I don't agree. Um, but in order to make that point, I want to take a closer look at the second ban rotation. Obviously, you see the Cho'Gath, and I think no matter if you're playing Zac or Blitzcrank or both or none, the Cho'Gath ban is 100% correct. Cho'Gath is just simply one of the strongest tank line champions that you have right now. He has a very strong laning power in terms of just staying in the lane, sitting there, and you still have a lot of damage potential in terms of true damage on enemy carries. That's something that Galio ult doesn't work around, and I think it's 100% the proper choice to ban the Cho'Gath. What I don't quite understand is the Corki ban out of SKT, because obviously, yeah, you have more roaming potential with the Corki than with, say, the Malzahar that Yahoo now locks in. But if you consider that RNG most likely, after the first phase of the draft, with the mentality that Let Me will always play and the champion pool that he has in mind, it's pretty safe to assume that you will be playing against a two-threat composition. With the two threats obviously being Xiaohu and Uzi. Now, if you pick the Blitzcrank, you definitely have one option left to play the game, and that is land the Blitzcrank hooks on either one of those two main carries, kill the carry at the beginning of the team fight, and afterwards play the remaining 4vs4 because Blitzcrank is pretty useless after that hook. Anyways, play the 4vs4 against a low damage team composition because they just lost 50% of their damage, or almost 50% of their damage because they lost one of their major carries. And then you should be doing fine because, well, you kind of like a support, they like a carry. You should win those team fights at any day. But banning away the Corki and leaving open the Malzahar gives RNG a very easy option of just getting a mid laner with the built-in get out of jail free card. The Malzahar passive simply negates any hook landing on him prior to any teamfight. SKT don't really have that much in terms of abilities that could pop the Malzahar passive before the actual teamfight begins, and even if they do, I think RNG still have the options, enough options left to just let Xiaohu sit back and recharge his passive before playing a bit more aggressive later on. So that's, I think, something that could have been done differently during the draft. But I do see a certain appeal to the Corki ban because obviously Xiaohu can use the Corki with the Valkyrie and the Stand United as a huge gank threat on the bot side, or use the package on the top side to snowball down onto Huni, and that's where we now have to look into the second draft phase, or the second pick phase of the draft. But before we get there, let's just briefly mention the two jungle bans that come out of RNG. RNG see the Blitzcrank, they think, okay, it's still Ardent Sensor meta, so let's now ban away the Ardent Sensor support, the Ardent Sensor junglers, most notably the Ivern, and then also the Nidalee. I don't think Blank would receive an Italy ban because of his aggressive playstyle. That's not what he's been known for throughout the later stages of his career. He's more of a conservative jungler, so I don't think RNG were banning away the Nidalee because of her potential to shut down the Sejuani during her weak early game. But I think it's more of the art and sensor consideration, which we also kind of see with the Ivern. Obviously, both champions have the potential of playing aggressive in the early game, but I don't think that's what was worrying RNG at this point. Now we see obviously SKT going for the Zac and thus also conceding their early jungle because, well, I think at least up until level 5, the elastic slingshot of Zac is more of a rigid slingshot because you cover hardly any distance to warrant the pick. And on the opposite side, you have a pretty safe bot lane already. Janna can simply counter each and every elastic slingshot attempt of the Zac prior to level 6 using her Holy and Gale. After level 6 you can also just use the Monsoon. And as you will see, with the Malzahar being left open, Zhao Hu can pick the Malzahar, who can use his silence to interrupt the channel of the elastic slingshot, thus making the ability pretty much useless during a team fight. And you also still have the passive of Malzahar, so your knock up of the elastic slingshot is more or less wasted, because usually the elastic slingshot will be the first damage that Malzahar will end up receiving at the beginning of a team fight. During the laning phase, obviously it could be slightly different, but then again, Galio doesn't really offer long range auto tags to proc the passive, so you have to use your Q and hit Malzahar with it, which I think is a pretty fringe case to actually trigger the passive. And I think as a result, you can see that both carry lanes are pretty well equipped to deal with both the Zac and the Blitzcrank later on. And after locking the Malzahar, obviously RNG complete their draft with the Shen. I think talked about it often enough. So yeah, obviously SKT expect the Shen pick. They know that Letme is a strong Shen player, and they've prepared the gangplank Wuhuni against it. Now, I really dislike the gangplank pick here because you are running a lot of risks by picking the gangplank. For one, you obviously run 3 off-meta champions right now, and usually champions are in the meta for very specific reasons. Usually one of them is they are pretty strong on this patch. So if you run a champion that isn't really meta or isn't really played that often, you have to warrant the champion's pick in terms of what he actually has to offer for your team composition, why you still should pick this champion. And I think the only thing that Gangplank has to offer in terms of team composition is his potential to outscale the Shen during the laning phase, but only at the very end of the laning phase, or maybe even only at later stages of the game, because you need like 2 to 3 items in order to have your barrels deal enough damage to trade with the Shen. Obviously, you still have your ultimate to kind of join in any potential team fight that Shen joins with the Stand United, but you don't have any hard CC to interrupt the Stand United. You don't have any early game pressure. You thus cannot really use the Galio ult on the top side. Offensively, you can just use it reactively. You don't have any dash to get the Galio ult into position. You need a lot of teamfight setup with the barrels, something that Twitch usually doesn't offer to enemies Also, with the spray and pray being able to just straight up shoot through your barrels, you lose a lot of team fight setup potential because, well, if Twitch opens up, you have to react immediately, and you don't have the time to set up your barrels that much. And if Twitch is just shooting straight through your team, you might as well just end up hitting one of your barrels by accident or by chance, and thus ruin your entire combo. At least I think that's what should be happening. I'm not sure if the barrels are hit by the spray and pray if they aren't targeted previously. So I could be wrong there, just correct me in case I get that wrong. And also, this kind of leaves Blank alone as the solitary initiator of any team fight. He's also the main source of CC. Overall, you have a lot of low CC champions in your team. And I even include Blitzcrank there because I think during a team fight, Blitzcrank's options of actually impacting the fight are pretty limited. You have a very brief AoE slow, silence, and you have your knock up on a very low cooldown, but also on a very low range. You will most likely only end up using it onto the enemy front line, which doesn't really do that much. And then you have the Galio, who has a bit more of CC potential, but I think you need, in the current meta, side laner with either CC or strong enough dueling potential even early on in the game. And I think we'll see later on what champion might fit that bill. Overall, I think RNG have achieved to assemble almost their entire dream team composition. I think they are pretty flexible in terms of the actual midline pick for Xiaohu. They've obviously considered Galio to be a pick for SKT. If you go throughout the series, it's not just the Malzahar that they have prepared as a potential counter pick. So they are doing fine against the Galio, at least in terms of what they can prepared for. And I think they have picked up a lot of comfort picks, a lot of champions that allow them to have a very explosive mid game. During the mid game, you can still use the Malzahar ulti to lock down enemy champions. They don't all run QSS already. You have to stand united, with the Shen actually still being able to do fine in the side lanes. You have the Sejuani for the pick potential. You have the Twitch to open up as a follow-up on almost any other CC, and you still have the Janna to peel for the Twitch and for the Malzahar. And I think overall this is like the dream composition for RNG. On the opposite side, for SKT, you have a composition that's very hard to execute. You have a lot of conditions that you have to meet in order to actually get to what your game plan is. You have to wait for Huni to get a couple of items before he can actually apply pressure on the side lane. So your macro game in terms of map play is hindered quite massively. And I think that part of the draft has kind of backfired or has hindered SKT's potential. You have the Zac, which doesn't do enough, I think, for the remainder of your team composition, and you have the Blitzcrank, who is pretty weak against RNG's team composition in later stages of the game. You have to thus snowball the early game on the bot side, while not completely losing the game on the top side. You have a very swingy map in general, and you have obviously Galio as an anchor, and maybe also Tristana as potential to snowball through early objectives, but then again, Blitzcrank doesn't really offer that much in terms of actually pushing your lane or pushing any wave. So I think SKT's draft doesn't fit their playstyle and their win conditions, their game plan, at least not as well as RNG's team composition does. RNG's team composition is easier to execute from my perspective, especially if you consider that Uzi will, despite being in a less favorable lane matchup, still get each and every single CS that he can afford to take, because that's just how good he is. And thus, I personally wasn't too surprised to see RNG actually pull out ahead in the first game. So that's it. That's my discussion for the first game between RNG and SKT. If you liked it, just leave a comment and maybe tell me what I should improve on, or tell me why you disagree on certain points and would like me to discuss, for example, I don't know, the mid lane matchup a bit further later on. Anyways, thanks for watching. Check out the remaining parts of my series, and I'll see you guys in the next video.